confirming what the date is and so forth, so they can document that.
And you do that?
I do that.
Okay.
Are we on,
You're
Barbara?
going to start it off.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yes, go. Okay, today is August 20th, 2003. We are with Mr. Donald Huling, and this interview is taking place at the Mary L. Cook Library in Waynesville, Ohio. Mr. Huling, we'd like to start today if you could give us a little background information about your time in the service and how you entered the service.
Okay, I entered the service a little past my 19th birthday, and I was inducted in LaSalle, Illinois, headed for Peoria, Illinois, where we were separated into different branches of service. And I was sent to the Army Air Force. I joined the Army Air Force and had basic training in Shepherd Field, Texas. In fact, I have a little story here that might help me put things in perspective. I call it the start of the big adventure.
Okay.
Which it certainly was. I was inducted into the Army on my 19th birthday, February 15th, 1945. I led the largest contingent of young men drafted from LaSalle through Oglesby area, that's up in Illinois, up to this point of the war. Those of us who passed the physical in Peoria and were assigned to the Army were bused off to Randolph Field near Rantoul, Illinois. We were issued Army clothing, which made us laugh at the first time we put on our fatigues. I can still see Teddy Elledge sticking toilet paper on cuts on his face he made with his newly issued GI Razor. We were given a battery of written tests, and as a result, I ended up in the Army Air Corps, headed for Chicago and radio school after 3 months of basic training in Shepherd Field, Texas. I shipped out of Texas by train and landed in Chicago. We were billeted in the Congress Hotel. I failed the Morse code class. That plus my poor eyesight meant I couldn't become a radio operator on any of the B-17 or B-24 bombers. Those that passed got to fly, man the radios, and fire machine guns. Well, actually, I'm glad I flunked out. Instead, I was assigned to continue school in Madison, Wisconsin, and Toma, Wisconsin, where we eventually became radio technicians proficient in the control network system, CNS. I'll refer to that a little later on. Basic training for me was great sport. It fit right in with my Boy Scout experiences. During the scouting, we'd lined up at attention, practiced marching and hiking, and found night activities such as capture the flag challenging. So when we had to do all these as part of basic training, I was ready. Okay, so Lindy and I were married on June 2nd in LaSalle. We'd gone together as all through high school. Our families knew each other. We went to the same church. So I was in the Army making $65 a month. Man, I could afford it. So we got married. She was 18 and I was 19 when we got married. And of course we couldn't spend much time together in Chicago. She came to Chicago after we were married, and I think it was like a weekend, and I had to go back to radio school, and she had a job with the Chicago Town and Trust Company, so we didn't have to spend much time in Chicago, and then I got sent to Madison. So up in Madison, here's another story I wrote. I call it AWOL with a question mark. Lindy and I were married June 2nd, 1943 in LaSalle, Illinois, while I was on a weekend pass from Chicago, where I was being trained in basic radio school. 1 week after we were married, I was transferred to Madison, Wisconsin for advanced radio school. Lindy and I hadn't seen much of each other since our wedding, as I had to stay at the Congress Hotel that first week. In fact, our honeymoon consisted of one night in our apartment up on Lawrence Avenue. I found a room in Madison, and a couple weeks later, Lindy arrived from LaSalle, where she had been recuperating after our one-night stand in Chicago. She had a job with the Chicago Title and Trust Company, which she held down for a week after I left, but we both wanted to be together as much as possible before I finished my training. I knew I could be shipped to the Pacific or the European theater of operations, as by now I had a pretty good idea of what we were being trained to do. Well, the room in Madison was near campus and was terrible. In fact, it was so bad the lady that lived in the house next door helped Lindy find a much nicer room the very next day. We still hadn't gotten together after about 3 weeks of marriage. I was getting desperate. Thought it looked like I was stuck out at Camp Truax Field until I could get a pass. Well, Friday night finally arrived, and I was the first GI in line to get my weekend pass. Our sergeant would hand out our pass when we stepped up and gave our name and serial number. My number was 36475-099. We were instructed to go to the next table, sign our name and serial number, and under the columns out and in, mark down the time we left base. Well, maybe I was excited about seeing Lindy or just thinking ahead, but once I got my pass, I walked right by the next table and out the door, where I caught the bus that was waiting to take a bunch of us into Madison. Well, Sunday night when I returned, I realized I could hang on to my pass just by keeping my mouth shut. That way I could visit Lindy every day, except there was one serious problem. Our advanced radio school was on 3 shifts and took place in buildings on the field. When we weren't in school for 8 hours, we were to fall out for PE, eat our meals on base, and kill some time before turning in for lights out at 9 p.m. Since we were on 3 shifts, and within each 90-man barracks, men were coming and going at around 11 p.m., the sergeant in charge of the barracks would check our name tags, which we were instructed to keep at the foot of our bunks, and list our radio school class number. Well, if an empty bunk belonged to a GI that was supposed to be in school, the sergeant was satisfied. Everything was fine. Since they also took roll at the beginning of each school shift, it looked like they had a foolproof system. Until I showed up, that is. I confided to my buddies, who I had been with in Chicago and who knew I had just got married, that I planned to go into town every day to be with my newlywed wife, but that I'd never miss a day of school. I'd never be AWOL from school. Well, the solution was really pretty simple. Since Sarge only did the bed check after 9 p.m., all I had to do was indicate on my bed tag the number of the class that was in school on the afternoon shift. It worked like a charm. I'd go to school every day, spend the rest of the summer day with my sweetheart. Well, I did have one close call. The phone rang at 4 a.m. one morning from one of my buddies, and he was desperate. He says, the captain in charge of the base was pulling a surprise bed check at 7 a.m., and I had no excuse for not being there. Don, he said, you better get your butt out here on the double. Wouldn't you know, the buses didn't start running until 7 a.m. Nothing I could do but face the music once I got out to camp. Well, it turned out I wasn't the only GI out to beat the system. When I didn't turn up on time, my buddies folded up my cot and hid it in the rafters above the latrine. The captain and Sarge never missed me. AWOL? I never missed a day of school. I saved the Army the food I would have eaten if I'd stayed out in camp. However, in retrospect, and as the fires of youth start to subside, I realize the system would not have worked as well as it did if everyone who wanted to be with their loved ones had pulled the stunt I was guilty of that beautiful summer of 1943.
So you got through without scathing.
Yeah, right. That was a close call. But like I said, we were sort of desperate to get together, and we knew time was running out. Didn't know what was going to happen. But Lindy stuck with me. We did go up to Toma, Wisconsin, and get advanced training. She came up for a couple of weeks, but she couldn't get a job up there. Too small. Then I was assigned to the Dynamite Gang. Okay, that's going to be the next story. So I was sent from Toma, Wisconsin, back home on a 2-week pass back to LaSalle. Then Lindy and I took off for California, where I joined the 367th Fighter Squadron, 367th Fighter Group. The pilots had been training flying the Air Cobra, and as I said before, I was a radio operator technician, so I joined a group of 9 other fellas. There were 10 of us in the control network system, and we had 3 radio trucks that we manned. We had a transmitter, a receiver, and a homing truck. The homing truck was a truck with an antenna on top that would turn, and we would be down below reading we could tell the pilots what direction to fly because we'd hear a voice null. So that was our 3rd truck. Well, it soon became apparent that we'd be heading for Europe. Here we are in California, but they said, no, you guys you're going to go over to Europe. So I put Lindy on the train to go home while I was going overseas. So we bid farewell, and it was sort of a sad time in our life, because we didn't know what was going to happen. Anyway, the train took us all the way across the states, and we landed at Camp Shanks, New York, where we boarded a ship heading for Europe. And the name of the ship was the Duchess of Bedford. You can maybe see that map up there. I don't show the states, but I do show up in Glasgow. We landed in Scotland. But here's a story about this trip on the, I entitled it A Trip on the Drunken Duchess. I was watching public TV a week ago, and a new book entitled Tuxedo Park was reviewed. It's the story of Alfred Lee Loomis, a Wall Street tycoon of the 1920s and 30s, who amassed a huge fortune, then used it and all of his energy to help win World War II. The book's fly reads as follows. In the fall of 1940, as German bombers flew over London, and with America not yet at war, a small team of British scientists, on order from Winston Churchill, carried out a daring transatlantic mission, which was to carry British military secrets to America. Now, on page 186 of the book, I was amazed to read as follows. Bowen, a British scientist who was carrying Britain's most valuable military secrets, including the latest radar developments, recalled that the name of the ship they boarded for America was the Duchess of Bedford. The Duchess earned her nickname Drunken Duchess for the way she would roll over the high seas. Our outfit boarded this same ship the end of March 1944. Accommodations on the ship for officers included staterooms for captains and higher ranks, while lieutenants had triple-deck bunks. Enlisted men, that's me, packed like cattle into the lower decks, and Lieutenant Reed observed that there would be one beautiful mess when this tub hits open sea. And he was right on. Those fortunate enough to find space slung hammocks, while the rest scrounged sleeping space on tables or on the decks. Well, I was one of the lucky ones and found a hammock right away. Once out to sea, where we joined a large convoy, all headed for Europe, the old Canadian passenger ship started to roll, and almost everyone got seasick. I was able to get out of my, quote, bed and head for the railing. I learned that walking on the deck in the fresh air helped to keep the food down. So that is what 2 or 3 of us fellows from the CNS gang did. Well, the food was terrible. We lived on peanuts we were able to buy from the ship's store. What a trip. Well, we landed in Glasgow, Scotland, way up there on that map. April 3rd, 1944, after an all-night ride that took us through blacked-out London, we arrived at our airfield in southern England, known as Stony Cross. The pilots had hoped to find P-51s waiting for them at this field, but instead found nothing but P-38s. That's this plane. This little plane over here is what they found. They were hoping for the P-51, but this is what they found, the twin-engine P-38. Already low from weeks of travel, their spirits sank a little more as they gazed on this depressing collection of twin-engine monsters. Well, this is in quotes now. Well, that's just another last straw, quipped Captain Jimmy Peck, the RAF veteran and hero of Malta. He was going to lead our 367 fighter group. Well, as he uttered the phrase, he had only one more week to live, and that's another story. So we had some time on our hands. We got to England, and of course the pilots were learning how to fly that P-38, and the story of Peck's accident, if I have time I'll make it back to that. That's really not my story, except all of us saw this poor guy crash first time he took it up. Very briefly, let me tell you what happened. He took up this plane. He'd been flying the Spitfire, which was a much lighter plane. He took this up, and when he came in for landing, this plane had a tendency to float a little bit more than the Spitfire would drop down dead. So he realized he was overshooting the field. He threw both throttles wide open, and this engine here on the left conked out on him. His wheels were down, like you see here, and he had only two choices, either to land and crash into some trees that were down there, or try to pull up and come around again, which he tried to do. And this engine conked out, like I said. So here he came over, down, and crashed, and he was thrown out of the airplane, and he died 20 minutes later, poor kid. He was only 20 years old. So anyway, our pilots said, you know, well, if this guy can't fly the plane, you expect us to fly it? So they brought over a test pilot from the States, and that guy, I think his name was LeVere, he put that plane through its paces. He would come in and he'd turn off one engine, and then he'd barrel roll the thing, he'd land it with one engine, and pretty soon the guy said, you know, maybe this isn't a bad plane after all. So, but they did take to it, and it turned out they really did like that plane. So while the pilots were learning how to fly, and they did get some missions in at this point too, because they were flying across the channel. This is before D-Day. Before D-Day, here's another little story, the V-1 flying bomb. Let's see, I'll start this off. I wrote this to one of my CNS buddies, and his name is Cummins, Andy Cummins. So I write to Andy, I say, I find I have time on my hands during these chemo sessions, so I'm catching up on some serious reading. I have reread Doris Kearns Goodwin's No Ordinary Time, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, The Home Front in World War II, and I'm almost finished reading Merrill Miller's Ike the Soldier as They Knew Him. Both books have mentioned subjects and times I recall living through. On page 520 of Goodwin's book, she talks about the V-1 flying bomb. The Germans started shooting at London early 1944. Al Keim, he's another one of my CNS buddies, Al Keim and I were in London on a weekend pass while those bombs were coming in. They were rocket-powered craft launched from giant concrete bunkers in Germany, in German-occupied territory in northern France. The V-1 carried more than 12,000 pounds of high explosives and fell indiscriminately on people and buildings alike. In 2 weeks, nearly 3,000 people had been killed and over 10,000 wounded. Well, Al and I didn't know these statistics, or we might have acted differently. We got a room on the 3rd floor of a cheap hotel near the heart of London. We were just climbing into our beds when we heard a V-1 chugging in. We had been told that the bomb was ready to drop when the engine stopped. We weren't about to hang around when this first one came in. We threw on our shirts and trousers and ran down all 3 flights of stairs. It kept chugging as it passed overhead and eventually went off with a loud bang. We climbed back up all 3 flights of stairs and tried to get some sleep when a second one came in. So it was run down 3 flights, wait, climb back up 3 flights. When the third one came in, we said, the heck with it. We became fatalists. If our number was up, it didn't matter if we were upstairs or downstairs. Oh, I think Al will remember that one. We had time to do a little sightseeing. One of our trips took us to Salisbury Cathedral because we were down in southern England at the time, and the cathedral was only about 10, 15 miles away. So this is a true story that I shared when I wrote this with my men's Bible study. I had planned to write this story for my grandchildren as a cute World War II experience. I now realize there's a lot more to this story than an experience with a funny ending. I was in southern England during World War II prior to the Normandy invasion. Our pilots were learning to fly the Lockheed P-38 they found parked at our field near Southampton. That gave me and 2 of my buddies time to go exploring. We decided to visit Salisbury Cathedral. We joined a group of about 30 other GIs with a guide who told us the history of this fine church and explained the layout. When we got to the high altar, me and my curious buddies noticed what looked like a door to one side that the guide failed to talk about. What could be behind that door, we asked each other. Let's find out. We hung behind the tour group and guide, and when they had left, we tried the door, opened it, and stepped behind the altar into a little room. Off to one side was another room that we figured was maybe a confessional. There was a table with a beautiful handcrafted doily that caught my eye. On the shelves were 3 or 4 bottles of wine we figured were to be used for communion. Well, temptation got the upper hand, and we wound up emptying all 3 bottles. The doily became even more attractive, and I grabbed it and put it in my pocket. When we emerged from behind the altar, the guide was quite upset. He thought he had lost us. Well, we weren't lost, just misguided. I carried that doily with me through France and Germany for the rest of the war. I brought it home and tried to display it on an end table that we had near an east window. Something was wrong. I had told my wife how I had, quote, liberated it, but she too felt it should not be displayed. We were both too proud to tell our friends the truth. About 5 years ago, my wife and I took a trip to England, and I had the chance to return the doily. We had visited Salisbury Cathedral, and I had not found the correct or comfortable opportunity to return it and confess my sin to someone. Well, outside in the fresh air and sunshine, I took a deep breath and resolved to try once more. I returned inside and found an usher for the Hopkins wedding that was taking place that afternoon. I told him my story, gave him the doily, and hastily retreated from church. When I returned to the States, I decided to write a letter to the head of the church and ask him for forgiveness. I received a letter back from him in which he stated he could not forgive me. That was between me and God. But for $100, I could become a lifetime support member of the church. I mailed him a check for $200 the next day. Yeah, that was quite a story. Okay, so anyway, it's time to get really involved in this war, and well, we have. Well, here's another story where we haven't quite crossed the channel yet. Oh wait a minute, I'm sorry. No, we had crossed the channel. Okay, we're back there. I can't look back there, but anyway, Wakefield was our sergeant. He was the head of the group, and he and I were on. We took off together on detached service. We crossed the channel real early on, and we got got stuck on the beaches. We were on the beaches before they broke out at St. Lo. The pilots and all the rest of the members of the 367 fighter group crossed the channel, and we were all sort of jammed up together there on the beaches. Way right over here. We landed at Utah Beach, and we had a couple airfields there. Then when Patton and the Army broke out at St. Lo, and they, as you probably know, they circled around and cornered the Germans there. Our pilots had a field day. In fact, they won some citations that I'll might refer to if I have time. But once Patton broke out and started chasing the Germans back across France and back into Germany, our supply lines got longer and longer and longer, so we finally had to move our airfield and we went way up here north of Rheims to Saint-Quentin. So, let me see here. Okay. So, and then from Saint-Quentin, we moved down to Rheims, right here, where we spent the winter of '44. There again, now when the weather got bad, we had some time on our hands, and I was the youngest guy in the 10-man crew. We were always had our trucks out at the end of the runway, so we were sort of off by ourselves. And here's a story. I wrote this to another one of, well, in fact, I wrote this story to the CNS gang. And I'm making reference to our 40th reunion, which is coming up this October 2nd through the 5th. So I say, Andy's letter of May 1st got me started calling all of you guys. Everyone's area phone number has changed since the last time I wrote, except George Roman's. I'll list them all at the bottom of this letter. I really enjoyed talking with Toxie, who's 88 years old. He's one of the oldest members in our 10-man group. He remembered I was the youngest. I'm 79. And recalled an adventure I had during the war that I've never put on paper. I'll title it, A Night with the MPs. The fall of 1944. We were settled into our airfield near Rheims, France. We had moved into a couple of bunkers that were near the end of the runway that the German gun crew had evacuated a few days prior to our arrival. The bunks were still hot, almost. They were well camouflaged and partially below ground. Each one was a snug little room with a roof, a floor, a door, with stairs leading up to ground level. There was even a little pot-bellied stove the Germans left behind. It was from this cozy environment I was commissioned to leave and go to Paris on a buying trip. I'd gone down to Paris a few weeks prior to this assignment and had returned with gifts I planned to mail home for Christmas. I picked up some prints of Paris that are framed and hang in our house here in Mason. I'd also found and bought some Lalique glassware that we still display, but the gift I returned with that caught the eye of Dan and Edge was a black Parisian hat, which I'll show you, a black Parisian hat that I had bought for Lindy. They asked if I would return to Paris and get a hat for each of their wives. But when the weather turned bad and our pilots couldn't do much flying, we found we had time on our hands. Our billets were out near the end of the airfield's runway, where we parked our CNS trucks. 8 of the 10 of us played bridge, so we could usually get at least one game going when we couldn't man the trucks. When I asked Sergeant Wakefield if I could take off for a couple of days to return to the city for Christmas presents for Dan and Edge, he readily consented. But he warned me, though, not to get into any trouble or to get picked up by the MPs. Hitchhiking back during those days, during those times was easy. I kept my Army Air Force jacket, clean and proud, and the patch on my left shoulder indicated I was a member of the 9th Army Air Force, who along with Patton's 3rd Army had Jerry on the run. The truck traffic between the port of Cherbourg and the front lines was heavy. A lot of these trucks ran through Paris, since this is where all the good roads were located. The trucks actually ran around Paris on the Red Ball Expressway. All the trucks that went up front, loaded, had to return. Most of the trucks were driven by black American soldiers who were really glad to be free and working for Uncle Sam. They were happy to pick up another GI so they could have someone to talk to. I returned to the same millinery shop where I had bought Lindy's elegant little black chapeau and picked out 2 more I thought Dan and Caudle's wives would like. I rode the subway back out to the outskirts of town where I picked up a ride back home. Well, by now it was getting late in the afternoon. A truck loaded with jerry cans full of gasoline picked me up right away. We were headed for the front lines, which were by now all the way to Metz, France, right on the border of Germany. I learned a whole lot later that Patton had a real fight on his hands when he tried to dislodge the Germans from their well-fortified positions in and around this town. Well, I really didn't care where we were headed as long as it was near our field outside Rheims. Well, it soon turned dark and started to rain. What a miserable night to get dropped off and try to find the ride back up to our field, which was off the main road. I decided to stick with the truck driver and try my luck in the morning when someone could see me in my uniform and give me a ride. "If I stay with you," I asked the black driver, "where do you think I could stay all night?" "Well, man, you can't stay with me, you know. I'll drop you off at the MP station. Maybe they will put you up for the night." "I'll stick with you for now," I replied. It wasn't long after this decision that we started to see what I thought was lightning off in the distance and the rumble of thunder. My driver soon put me straight. "That's cannon fire up ahead, man. We're getting close to the front lines." I swallowed hard and crossed my fingers. Had I made the right decision? I got out of the truck at the MP station and explained to one of the GIs with the white armband and white helmet that I was trying to get back to my outfit, back near Rheims, and asked if they had a place I could bed down for the night. "We got plenty of room, and we will even feed you if you're hungry," he replied. Well, things were starting to look better already. The MPs had taken over a German brewery, so I not only got food to eat, I got a canteen full of beer to drink. The beer was pretty strong, I found out, and I was tired from traveling all day. So I asked him where I could crawl up and sleep. "Right upstairs," the MP told me. Upstairs was nothing but a wooden floor. No cot, no mattress, no nothing. But it was dry. I found some old newspapers over in one corner that I spread over me, and in a few seconds I was out like a light. In the morning, I had a good breakfast and was on my way home. The MP stopped the Jeep that was headed my way, and off I went with my package under my arm. You know, those MPs were really nice fellows. They never even asked to see my pass. Good thing they didn't, because I didn't have one. Oh, well, the Sergeant Wakefield, he was the head of this group, really a nice guy. And he and I took off a couple times on different occasions, which I'll tell you about right now. It says, I wrote the following letter to Sergeant Wakefield on September 27th, 1991, and decided to make it part of our story and add it to the section entitled The Warriors, 1943, 1944, 1945. Dear Wake, I received a copy of the letter you wrote to Dan Morris, 7 August 1991. Today, I can't think of anything else but the many experiences you and I had together when we were, quote, out on the town on 2 different occasions. The first time we took off from the rest of the gang was after D-Day, when we crossed the English Channel with our radio trucks and landed on Omaha Beach prior to the breakout at St. Lo. The second time we took off was in the fall of 1944 to go up to Liège, Belgium, to help man radio equipment used to direct our fighter planes to their targets outside Aachen, Germany. The 366th Fighter Group that were flying the P-47s, oh, and by the way, here's what that group was flying, the P-47. Let's see, and in our 367th needed our help. Those two squadron, yeah. I got sick on that one and didn't see much action out in the line. The Dynamite Gang, and this is a book that has been written about our adventures. The Dynamite Gang describes the activities of the advanced echelon on page 59 as follows. To prepare for the 367th movement to France, the squadron advanced echelon began the trip across the Channel on July 19th. Wearing full infantry field equipment, the men took with them enough vehicles and equipment to set up housekeeping in 3 separate Normandy airfields. At the marshalling yard near Dorchester, they received field rations, wax field stores, a Guide to France booklet, cigarettes, matches, delousing powder, wax bags for use aboard ship, you know what that's for, and French francs to replace their English money. The 392nd went to A-10 Carrollton. The advanced echelon pitched tents, dug foxholes, and prepared the fields for the arrival of our P-38 pilots and ground crews. Well, Wake, our activities were somewhat different than the official version. I don't remember if you asked for a volunteer or if you appointed me to go with you as part of the advanced echelon. But before we took off, I acquired 2 ceramic hot plates that we were able to plug into our truck's electrical system in order to heat coffee and sea rations. I put these into the truck along with 3 cushions from our cots that we were lucky enough to find in our hut at Stony Cross. I threw in 2 wooden collapsible cots too. We took off for the loading area in Southampton. I remember we were bumper to bumper for miles. One spot I jumped out of the truck and ran up to a little restaurant that was selling fish and chips. Well, chips turned out to be French fries. We finally got down to the docks where the Navy lifted up our truck and dropped it into the hold of a flat-bottomed ship, the LST landing ship tank. While everyone else was up above watching the crossing, I nosed around down in the hold of the ship and found a huge supply of rations the sailors had put down below for themselves. Well, when no one was looking, I grabbed about 5 large boxes of the stuff and slipped them into our truck. When we finally got off the LST and onto the beach, we drove up and parked alongside a hedgerow. I remember looking on the other side and seeing this huge stack of wooden boxes. I asked you what was in them. You recognized the boxes as being shells for cannon. I thought to myself, hope Jerry doesn't drop a bomb on that pile of stuff. We'd all be blowing the kingdom down. I didn't really have much to worry about, as the airspace above the beaches was controlled by our Air Force, probably our own pilots from the 392nd Fighter Squadron. The cots and hot plates came in handy that 2 or 3 weeks that we were stuck on the beach. You rigged up a metal base for the hot plates and figured out a way to hang our cots from the wall of the inside of the truck using parachute harness. There was abundance all over the place. When we cracked open the Navy rations, I realized the Navy guys were going about their job on full stomachs. The boxes were loaded with good things to eat, especially the bacon. We had a real good thing going, until one day our communications officer dropped by to see how we were doing, and discovered we were doing better than he was. He made us take down our cots and sleep outside the truck like the rest of the guys were doing. Well, we finally got our orders on 27th July to move off the beaches and head for Carrollton. We drove down part of the Red Ball Expressway. The engineers had laid a 4-inch pipeline alongside the road that was pumping gasoline up front as fast as they could to keep up with General Patton, who had Jerry on the run. On the highway, there were trucks pulling pontoons for building bridges, trucks hauling gasoline in 5-gallon cans, and so forth. We were all headed east as fast as we could go. You used to drive with your left hand on the wheel and a cigarette in your right hand. That sort of scared me, especially when we started down a hill. We would all go down as fast as the truck and trailer would go so we could get up the other side without shifting gears. I rode shotgun and you poured it on. What a ride. We got to A10 and our first job was to put up the antenna at the end of the runway. The engineers had built a landing strip out of metal that they hooked together. I came close to dropping a coil of wire on your foot in my eagerness to get the equipment out of the truck and get into business helping the pilots blast Jerry. Now again, quoting from the Dynamite Gang, that book, here's what the author says about the CNS gang. Dynamite, dynamite, casket for homing. The call for help came often to Dynamite Donovan. That wasn't his real name. No one remembers it after all these years. Yet he was the most important man on the ground when the pilots were on a mission. Donovan ran the 367th Fighter Group's control tower and direction finding facility. The CNS gang manned 2 trucks, a transmitter, receiving truck, and a homing truck. Each truck had its own gasoline-driven electric power unit. The homing truck had an antenna on top that was controlled by a CNS man from below. We had to pick up a voice null in order to give the pilots a heading for home. Donovan gave the pilots their takeoff and landing instructions. When the situation required, he could recall them before they reached their target or even change their target assignment while they were in the air. Most important, he could guide them home if they ran into bad weather or became lost over enemy territory. He provided the vital radio link between the pilots and their base. The second time we took off from the rest of the boys was in the fall of 1944. The 367th was at Juvencourt near Reims, having arrived there 28th of October, 1944. We took off in an army truck with CNS guys from other 2 squadrons. We drove through Liège and kept going until we got pretty close to Aachen, Germany, where the 367th was doing ground support. I came down with the flu and didn't do much that whole trip except stay in bed, drink lots of liquids, and take aspirin. I finally got well enough to take a shower in a building that had been used by coal miners to clean up after working down below all day. I left the building and took a short trip down the road where I saw something I'll never forget. I stumbled onto a military cemetery that was in full operation. I asked one of the GIs who was working there if he would show me and explain to me what was going on. Well, I found the Army was very well organized in this respect. A bulldozer had dug a trench about 5-6 feet deep and about a city block long. Jeeps with 2-wheel trailers behind would bring in dead bodies, some fully clothed, others naked depending where they found them. The sergeant in charge would go through the dead person's wallet and remove anything that might embarrass his family. Then he would put all personal belongings in a little cloth bag with the guy's name, rank, serial number, and address of his next of kin. All this information was found on the GI dog tags. I still have mine. Next, they took one dog tag and nailed it to the back of the guy's skull with 2 nails. The second dog tag was later nailed to the white cross they placed at the head of the grave. The bodies were all slipped into white cotton bags, then laid out nice and neat in the trench. Next day, the bulldozer came and covered up the grave, and the crosses were placed at the head of each man. Well, needless to say, I was glad when you and I headed back to Juvencourt and the rest of the CNS gang. We didn't know the Germans were getting ready to bust out in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge on December 16th. You know, Wake, as I look back now on our year and a half together, I think we had a really great gang of fellows. As I remember, you never got excited, angry, or upset. There were never any arguments about work assignments, passes to leave the base, or disagreement among the fellows, Al Kime and I were allowed to lay in, Al was allowed to lay in his bunk all morning, and George Roman and I were allowed to get up early and set rabbit traps. We really had a pretty good time. Never fired a shot in anger. In fact, I lost my carbine rifle while on detached service in Belgium. I found one in a ditch just before inspection. I didn't have time to clean it up, and wouldn't you know it, the major that was inspecting our equipment looked down the barrel of my gun and couldn't believe what he saw. He said, "Hold this man's pass and keep him on base till he gets his gun cleaned up." I spent the rest of that weekend trying to get the dirt and rust out of the barrel. How are we doing on time, okay?
We have about 10 minutes, and so I don't know what you want to point to
Well,
as most important in that time that's left. Were you involved in the Battle of the Bulge?
we had returned back to Reims about 10 days prior to the Battle of the Bulge. And in fact, this my reference to my little gun, when we left Belgium, I left my gun under the bunk. I lost my rifle. So we get back to base, and the Battle of the Bulge, and our CO, pulled an inspection, a gun inspection, and that's when, well, I was lucky. I found a gun in a ditch. Probably some paratrooper had lost it, so I did have a gun for the inspection. But that was about as close as I got to the Battle of the Bulge.
Okay.
My wife is probably more upset about it than I, because our mail was stopped, and we had a little code worked out. She knew where I was all the time. If I would mention in my letters a friend of ours, Bill Gephardt, I saw Bill Gephardt, and then she'd take the first letter off the rest of the names of the people I would mention. So she knew I was up near Liège, for instance, or up near Aachen. And then, of course, the Battle of the Bulge, all the mail was stopped. So she didn't know where I was. She thought I was in the middle of it. Fortunately, I wasn't. But anyway, she finally got all those letters in a big pile. And her dad said, "Oh, don't worry, Lindy, don't worry about Daniel. He'll talk himself out of it if he gets captured." Well, he's more optimistic than I. We did get into Germany, and let me read you this last one, our commandeered cars. Again, I'm writing to Al Kime, and I say, Al got me reminiscing to Lindy about the 3 automobiles we acquired shortly after getting settled in our airfield in Frankfurt, Germany. We got to Germany on April 9th, 1945, and settled in to our airfield near Frankfurt. This field had a large cement runway that was covered one morning with refugees fleeing the Russians. The war in Europe was almost over. In fact, VE Day was May 8th, only a month away. Well, I was involved in commandeering the Opel that you mentioned. We drove to Zinburg to view the remains of Kesselring's castle headquarters. Our outfit got a citation for taking out, disrupting Kessel communications as we near Germany. So we wanted to go up and view this. The dictionary defines commandeer as follows: to seize private property for military or public use, as in the sentence, all automobiles in town were commandeered by the Army. Well, I'm not sure who was with me, might have been you, Al, when we decided we needed a car so we could go sightseeing. We couldn't use our Army trucks for this kind of activity. As I recall, we simply went into town carrying our carbine rifles, and when we spotted the Opel, we got in and drove off, without so much as a salute to the owners, who never even showed up to complain. Well, once back at the field, we took it directly to the paint shop. They were doing a landslide business, painting cars Army olive drab. We even got a white star and some meaningless numbers stenciled to the side door. I did hear later that when we left to head back to France in the Pacific, all commandeered cars were returned to their original owners. Well, we have an open-top 2-door sedan that someone acquired and painted. I have a picture of you, Al, in the driver's seat with George Roman sitting next to you in front. and I'm in the back with 5 other fellows, including Dan, Edge, and Toxie. Now, Dan, Edge, and Toxie were our oldest fellows, and I don't think they ever left camp. But the rest of us, we were sort of having a ball because the war was almost over. We had the most fun in our 8-passenger bus. We couldn't drive it very fast because of a kink in the drive shaft. The bus needed a new motor when we got it. I think we got it from some officers who had burned up the original motor. George Roman and some of the other guys who were handy around cars found a used motor and somehow stuck it in under the hood. Only problem was the drive shaft was too long, so George cut it off with a torch and welded it back together so it would fit. We took a number of trips up and down the Autobahn in this vehicle, shaking and laughing all the way. Okay, any questions?
As we come to a close, is there anything that you would like to mention about your time in the service or World War II in general, or anything that you would like to summarize?
Yeah, I think I do have another, just a little story if I can find it here. Let's see if I can find it, yeah. This sort of summarizes the whole thing. It was in 1949, Peter Moody published an excellent history of the 367th and reflected on the deeper, more enduring meaning of its outstanding combat record. And here's what he wrote. The fact that over 1,000 men, militarily inexperienced and strangers to each other, could organize, train, and within a short time achieve a notable combat record against the enemy is a remarkable tribute to our nation and to the men themselves. For these 1,000 men, from diverse backgrounds, education, creeds, and beliefs, did have a mutual element. They were all Americans, loved their country, and were willing to sacrifice to submit self to service. From this common bond, they were sufficiently flexible and strong enough to forge a spirit and a pride that made the 367th, at least for them, unique. It was their unit. Proof lies in the fact that several years after the war, and after those 1,000 men had long separated to their individual aspirations and careers, the 367th Fighter Group Association was formed, and reunions are being held regularly. Pride and devotion to the unit remain. Men don't share the hardships and sacrifices of military service without benefit. Our gain has been mutual. It is principally of the mind and the heart. It includes ruggedness, tolerance, patience, and friendship. The 10 members of the CNS gang were so eager to get on with our lives that we lost touch with each other for many years. My first contact with any member of the gang was in 1984. Lindy and I attended a get-together of the non-commissioned 367 personnel in Washington, D.C., where I met Pat Tramatazzi, who had attended other get-togethers of this group. Then in 1991, all of us, except Wakefield, Abeda, and Kime, got together in Memphis, Tennessee. This included Edge, Dan, Griff, Pat, Andy, George, and myself. We all did it again in 1992, including Al Kime, out in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Andy Cummins and George Roman hosted smaller get-togethers in their homes. We didn't attend a big one until 1999, when those of us who were still able got together in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And we are going to have another reunion this October.
What does getting together for these reunions do for you?
It does pull us together, and we usually reminisce on different stories and tell how we won the war. They couldn't have done without us. That kind of stuff, you know. Stories get bigger and bigger. But anyway, that's usually what we talk about, you know.
Is there anything else you'd like to mention before we close?
This plaque is pretty neat to me and to my kids. I decided to not only stick these ribbons and stuff on there, but I decided to tell what they were and how we received all this stuff. So that hangs on the wall, and it is sort of meaningful now.
And what can you quickly kind of go through what they are?
Well, okay, we received a Presidential Unit Citation, and it was work that our pilots did. And I'll just read it as briefly. It says, for its outstanding achievements, on August 25th of 1944, the 367th Fighter Group received this Presidential Award that stressed the pilot's gallantry in action and the ground crew's professional support skills. The bronze oak leaf cluster, it's stuck on there, was awarded for the March 19th, 1945 near flawless raid on the castle headquarters of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, German Commander-in-Chief West. I touched on that when I was talking about those cars. Then this is the American Campaign Medal. The criteria is service outside of the United States for 30 days. We also, now this is probably the most important one of all, it's the European, African, Middle Eastern campaign. There's one silver star, and that represents 5 battles that our pilots win. There's Normandy, Northern France, the Ardennes, the Rhineland, and Central Europe. Then we have a bronze star there for the air offensive in Europe. Then over here is the Army Good Conduct Medal. Believe it or not, I got one of those after all those wild stories I told you. These are the 2 types of planes our pilots flew. This was, we started out with the P-38 Lightning, and that was flown from April of 1944 to February of 45. Then we got the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and that was flown from February 45 to May 8th of 1945. And I attained the rank of corporal, 9th Air Force, radio operator technician, and these are my dog tags. And for my grandchildren's, I interpreted the dog tags. The 36475-099, my serial number. T43-4, what does that mean? Well, it means I got 4 tetanus shots in 1943. Okay? 0 means I had blood type 0, and P, Protestant, my religion. So that's sort of an important plaque.
Very nice. Well, thank you very much for your interview. We appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure.
Okay. This guy was